In the Old Testament, God tells the people of Israel to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And that command is echoed again by Jesus when the Pharisees, these religious leaders, come to him and ask him, "Teacher, which is the greatest of the commandments? Which is the greatest of the laws?" And Jesus responds by saying, "The first and the greatest commandment is that you love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind." And what we're going to talk about is what that essentially boils down to. Because what that passage is communicating, what the command is communicating, is that we love God with all that we are. That we love God with all that we are in everything that we do. That every single facet of our life, every single aspect and element of who we are should be for the glory of God. That we love God with all that we are in everything that we do. You know, there's another passage of Scripture in 1 Corinthians 10:31 that kind of reissues that same kind of command, that talks a little bit more about that idea. It's in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 31. It says, "So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God." That from the most mundane task, such as getting up in the morning or having a bowl of cereal, to the most prestigious and most complex and amazing task that you could do, to like flying a shuttle for NASA or something like that, running for president and winning the presidential nomination. From the most mundane to the most prestigious task, all the things that we do, everything that we are, is meant to glorify God. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump to Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20 is the 10 Commandments. And what we're going to look at the first 3 commands, because those first 3 commands help us to put some flesh on this idea of what it means to grow in our relationship with God, of what it means for us to be able to interact with God in a way where we understand that God is not just this abstract idea, but that God is a person, and that God is speaking to us, and that as he speaks to us, that we're to respond to the things that he says. So we're going to look at some of the things that God says about how he wants us to interact with him, his boundaries, his ground rules. Kind of like when a person begins to date somebody else, you might want to lay down some ground rules as far as what you will do and what you can't do, the kind of conduct that you will have in your relationship. And you do the same thing in a marriage. Your marriage covenant, the vows that you take, those are your boundaries. Those are the things that you kind of set down as the operating rules, the things that you're going to do to be able to honor and love one another, to remain intimate with one another. So that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at the things that God has said about how he desires for us to relate to him so that we can have an intimate relationship with him. So if you have your Bibles, we're going to turn to Exodus chapter 20, and we're going to look at the first 3 commands. This might look a little bit different because normally when we think about the 10 commandments, we have these shortened versions that we've memorized. So it's going to look a little bit different here. Okay, but Exodus chapter 20, starting in verse 1. This is what it says. "Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of slavery. Do not have other gods besides me. Do not make an idol for yourself, whether in the shape of anything in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the waters under the earth. You must not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the father's sin to the 3rd and 4th generations of those who hate me, but showing faithful love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commands. Do not misuse the name of the Lord your God, because the Lord will not leave anyone unpunished who misuses his name." So that's a lot of stuff there, but those are the first 3 commands. The first command, do not have other gods besides me. The second one, do not make an idol for yourself, and a lot of other stuff that he says. And then the third one, do not misuse the name of the Lord your God. So we're going to talk about the first one. The first one is, do not have any other gods besides me. What does that mean, to not have any other gods besides me? I don't know if you've ever seen a Tyler Perry movie or a romantic comedy where you have this man that is married and then he just happens to have a mistress or a girlfriend or something like that. And inevitably in one of those kinds of movies, what happens is there's this scene where the wife and the mistress or the girlfriend, they meet right? And then they have this awkward situation where the guy is there witnessing this catfight that ensues between his wife and his mistress. And one of the things that you might hear from the wife is, to get that witch out of my face, right? To get that person, that woman that has come between you and me out of my presence, because she has gotten between you and me. And that's kind of what is being communicated here. Kind of like that hand in the face, that snap, snap, snap kind of thing. Get out of here. That is what is happening in this passage. That's what God is saying. God is saying, you and I are in an exclusive relationship. So there should be no other gods between you and me. There should be, get them out of my face. Get anything that will compete for your affection, for your time, for your energy, any of those kinds of things. Get them out of my presence. Get them out of your life. Because all of your time, all of your energy, all of your focus shouldn't be on these other things that draw you away from me. All of your attention and focus should be on me. That there's nothing that should get in between you and me so that we can continue to be intimate. That's what God's saying in this text, in this passage. That there should be no other things that compete for your time, for your energy, for your attention, that draw you away, that lead you away from God. God doesn't want that to happen because he wants to be in an intimate relationship with you. He wants you to be close to him. So when we have these things that compete for our attention, for our time, all these false gods, because there's only one God, just like in that relationship with that man and that woman, when husband and wife are there, there's only one husband, one wife, not husband with multiple wives or wife with multiple husbands, only one. Commitment to one. In the same way, in our relationship with God, there is no other God. There's only room for one God. There is only one God. And that's what God is communicating in that text. The second commandment that we see, which is, you shall have no idols. Okay, this is pretty long. Let's go ahead and read that again really quickly. When we look at it, it starts in verse 4. Do not make an idol for yourself, whether in the shape of anything in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the waters under the earth. You must not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the father's sin to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing faithful love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commands. So let's break that down really quick and think about what that is saying. Because when I was growing up, I think that I thought about this passage a lot like the first command. I thought that the second commandment was kind of like the first one. But that would make no sense because God's not going to have two commands that say the exact same thing. So it must be communicating a different idea. So when we look at you shall have no idols, that you're not going to make anything in the heaven above or in the earth below or the waters underneath that's going to try to that's going to be an idol. That's going to be something that takes worship from me. This isn't so much. So let's go back up a minute. Okay, so that first command is, you shall not have any other gods before me. So typically when people talk about having idols, that's what they're meaning. They're meaning like we shouldn't have anything else that we make a false god out of, that we set up as a false god. That's the first commandment. There's no other gods. So there should be nothing that competes for your attention. No other false gods. That's the first commandment. So then how is the second commandment different? Well, when it's talking specifically, let's look at that again. Do not make an idol for yourself, whether in the shape of anything in the heavens above, or in the earth below, or in the waters under the earth. You must not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the father's sin and all that stuff right there. Okay, so what's the idea that's being communicated? Let me kind of give you an example. Let's just say for me, okay, for me, right now, at this point in time, I'm still in the United States Army, so I'm a soldier. I'm also working at a church. I'm also a student. And then I'm also someone that does martial arts. So there's these different parts of who I am. And I have different circles of friends in each of those different areas. But you might have had a similar experience where you might have a group of friends where they begin to talk about you and only communicate with you on one part of who you are. So when I talk to my friends at Taekwondo that do martial arts, the only thing that they ever talk to me about, the only thing that they engage me on in their group of friends, the only thing that they kind of include me in their conversations about that have things to do with Taekwondo, with martial arts. They don't take into account that I have some other experiences out of martial arts, out of Taekwondo, that I have other life experiences, that I'm not just some guy that does Taekwondo day in, day out, all the time, that there's other parts of me, that I'm also a student. And think about that. If I was at some gathering, some party or something like that, and then there's a group of people that are having this conversation, and then one person that's there only knows me as a student. They know nothing else about me. They just know that I go to school with them. And then for them to begin engaging in a topic that I might have some knowledge about, like let's say about the crisis in the Middle East that's happening right now with ISIL and all that kind of stuff. I was actually there a couple of times to be in the same regions that all this fighting is happening, so I might know a little bit about that. So if they were to exclude me from that conversation and not take into account these other parts of who I am, that might upset me or anger me. I don't know if you've ever had that kind of experience before, where people kind of limit or constrain who you are to just one aspect of who you are. Like let's say, for example, if you worked at McDonald's, right? You worked at McDonald's, but then you don't just work at McDonald's, you're also a mother. Maybe you also happen to be an accomplished fencer or something like that. For the people that you know to only talk about you as an employee of McDonald's and not acknowledge the other parts of who you are, that can be frustrating and really annoying, and you probably wouldn't want to spend time with those people anymore. Well, within this passage, what God is saying is, hey, there's nothing that exists in the heavens, on the earth, or in the oceans below that can encapsulate who I am. And you might hear this a lot of times in church, in sermons or in Bible studies or anything else like that, where people will try to explain God using some example, some like analogy. Like they'll talk about like, how can we explain the Trinity? Well, let's explain the Trinity by talking about water, how God exists in these three different forms, but it's all H2O, stuff like that, right? That stuff's not bad, but they can't totally encapsulate something that is so big, so unknowable as God. So when we do that, what we're doing is we're beginning to put God in a box, and we're constraining our worship of God to just this one element that we see and can understand. But God doesn't want us to constrain the way that we worship Him to just a part of who He is. He wants us to know Him in all of who He is. Think about how weird that might be if you were in a relationship with someone, in an intimate relationship. Like let's say like if you were married, right? You only talk about your spouse, you only engage with your spouse in one of their hobbies. Let's say that one of their hobbies is archery, right? You only talk to them about archery whenever you see them. You only talk about them as an archer, and then you don't acknowledge what they do in their workplace. You don't acknowledge who they are as far as the things that they like in their other hobbies. Like, I don't know, maybe they're in a reading club or something like that. But if you understand what I'm trying to communicate, what I'm trying to communicate is that God wants us to know all of who He is, not just a part of it. So when we create these images or these analogies, they don't have to necessarily even be physical objects. They can be mental constructs. Those things can become idols too, because they constrain our worship of God to just one aspect of who He is. And God doesn't want us to just know part of who He is. He wants us to know all of who He is in every aspect. So He wants us to grow in our knowledge of Him, to grow and deepen our intimacy with Him by seeing Him in different ways, by seeing different parts of His character, experiencing Him in different ways, not just in the same way. That yes, God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, but that God doesn't always work in the exact same way, and that He can surprise us sometimes in the way that He chooses to reveal Himself. So, and the things that we might learn about Him, not in totally new ways, but in the same way. You know, like when I was a child, my concept of grace was very different from where it was when I was 19, and then from where I was when I was 24. My ideas of grace and how God gives me his grace and how I experience it in my life, they change over time, and I have been able to experience that in different kinds of ways. But if I just had this one little mental construct and said that this is the only way that God can show grace, this is the only way that I experience God's grace, this is the only way that God does grace, then I'm limiting myself from being able to experience Christ in a fresh new way each day. So they're not new things, not new concepts, same thing, but I get to learn different aspects of that from different experiences that I might have with him. So that's part of what we looked at in the second commandment, that do not make an idol for yourself, whether in the shape of anything in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the waters under the earth. You must not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the father's sin to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing faithful love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commands. So that's something else that we should probably talk about really quickly, because I don't think I put it in these notes, but you're going to read it, so let's talk about it. So normally when we do this, I would ask you some questions. One of those questions I might ask you is, do you think it's fair that God would punish children for the things that they didn't do but that their fathers did? Okay, and then don't get off on a tangent, because that's not what this passage is talking about anyway. But we'll talk about that just so that we can help you guys to remember that when we look at a passage of text, we need to look at the fullness of what it's saying within the thought block so that we can understand what it means, so that we can know how it applies to our life. So we're not trying to let this digress into whether or not God is a just or fair God, because that's not what God is saying here or communicating anyway. The thing that he is saying is that when I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the father's sin to the third, fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing faithful love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. One of the things that was really helpful for me in seminary, one of my professors told me the keys to understanding the Old Testament is that there's lots of imagery, and you got to think about agriculture, right? So one of the things that helps me to understand this passage is the image that is being described here. When you think about the children that you might have, you have children, and then maybe you might live long enough to be able to see your grandchildren. If you're very fortunate, you might live to see your great-grandchildren. And if you're really, really fortunate and become really super old, like over 100 years old maybe, or maybe you started really, really young, then you might get to see your great-great-grandchildren. But typically, most people will not get to see more than their third or fourth generation. Maybe even they'll be lucky if they get to see the second generation that comes after them. And what God is communicating here is that if you do not follow me, if you do not love me, if you do not walk in a relationship with me, then the effects, the consequences of that will affect not just you and your life, it affects your children's life. And it will affect the lives of your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren. It's going to affect the lives of people far beyond what you thought. That the consequences for what we decide to do today have great implications for posterity. That the things that we do today don't just affect us, they affect other people too, and we need to be mindful of that. So when he says that, and you know that thing that he says is supported within our research today. When we think about people that are alcoholics, there's a good chance that their parent was an alcoholic. When we look at people that are divorcees, single parents, right? There's a good chance that their parent was also a single parent. And that's actually one of the statistics about teen moms. Teen moms, if they have a kid, there's a very high percentage that that child will also be a teen mom. And the same goes for lots of other things, with sexual abuse, or with gambling, or overeating, or you name it. So many different kinds of decisions that people make that they think will only affect them, but that actually have great ramifications for their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. It affects other people. But then there's a promise that's also in this passage. When we look at it, it says that I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the father's sin to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing faithful love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commands. So that just to say that, yes, when you choose to walk away from me, when you choose to live in sin, that it's going to affect not just you, it's going to affect other people for a few generations. You won't know how big of an impact it will have on your children, your grandchildren, great-grandchildren, to the third and fourth generation. But then he says, following that he shows faithful love to those that love him. For, what does it say? It says, it shows faithful love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commands. That's a great promise. To know that while there are consequences to our sin that don't just affect us, but affect our children, grandchildren, all that kind of stuff, that the effect of following Christ, of living for God, of loving God with all that we are, that you can't put a quantity on that. You can't measure it. That God's love for you in responding to the love that you've given to him affects thousands of generations. Whereas before, it affects maybe the third and fourth generation beyond what you can see in your lifetime. That the effect of someone following after God, following Christ, goes far beyond that. So that's what it's communicating there. The last one, the last commandment that we're going to look at is, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. What does that mean? What does it mean to not take the name of the Lord your God in vain? When I was a kid, I thought that what that meant was that I couldn't curse. That you can't say Jesus or Christ. And then you can't say four-letter words or stuff like that. But that's not what it's communicating here either. It's not saying that when you should not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, that you will not curse. What it is saying is that, if you think about this, let's think about this woman that might get married to a very wealthy or influential family. Let's say she gets married to the son of the President of the United States of America. When she gets married to the son of the President of the United States of America, her name changes. She takes on the name of the President of the United States. So the things that she does, they don't just affect her now, they also affect her family, because she's taken on the name of the President of the United States, because she married the son of the President of the United States. So the things that she does are now a reflection on her family, on her husband, and then also on her father-in-law. And in the same way, when we take on the name of Christian, when we take on the identity of child of God, then we do the same thing. We do the same thing because when we become a follower of Jesus and we take on the name of Christian, child of God, the things that we do don't just affect us now. They also affect the way that people perceive and view God. They affect the way that people perceive and view other believers, people that are part of the family of God. So this is an important concept, and this is something that we've talked about before in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, that when we enter into a relationship with God, that we become his ambassadors. So the things that we say and the things that we do, they reflect on God himself. And when we use his name specifically, we have to remember that the name of God is something that is reverenced and holy. When the people of Israel would talk about God, they had so much reverence for the name of God that they omitted the vowels so that they wouldn't say his full name, because they had so much reverence for the name of God, because the name of God represents God's glory. It represents who he is. Like when you talk about being a Vanderbilt or a Rockefeller or someone like that, a Carnegie, those kinds of names and having that kind of heritage or that lineage, that carries some weight. And in the same way, when you take on the name of Christ, that has even more weight. And we have to be conscious of that we do not take the name of the Lord our God in vain, because whenever we do things that are not characteristic of a child of God, that are not in line with the things that God has asked us to do, it's not going to just affect the way that people view us, it's going to affect the way people view God. So bringing all of this stuff back to how do these three commands help us to interact with God, and how do they dictate the boundaries of our relationship with God, is that, one, God doesn't want us to be in a relationship with anyone else. There's only one God. There's no room for anyone else. So get all those other things out of the way. The second one is, don't limit your affection or your love for God to just a part of who he is. Love God for all of who he is. You know, people will talk about how God is love. Well, that's true. That's a part of who God is. But that's not all of who God is. That there's parts of God that we also need to recognize do exist, like his wrath, like his mercy, like his anger. Those are things that are part of who he is too. We can't just say, oh, you can't be angry, God, because you're just love. And you can't be jealous, God, because in the way that we define and understand love, that jealousy is a bad thing. But then here's the deal, is that all those words that we take, love, jealous, all these different emotions, that the way that we define them from our perspective isn't the way that they should be defined. That the way that we see God acting throughout Scripture is the way that we should define those kinds of things. That our definition for love doesn't define God, but that God defines the way we define love. The way that we see God act is the way that we define love. So the third one, you should not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Take the name of God seriously, because when you take on the name of God, it doesn't mean, what it means is that the things that you say and the things that you do don't just affect you. They affect other people as well. They reflect on God because you represent him. You're now in relationship with him. You are part of his family. You are a child of God. And those are the ways that God has spoken to his people, both in the Old Testament and also in the New Testament, about how he desires for us to be able to interact with him so that we can grow in our intimacy with him. Some of the base guideline rules.